Alpha Command, come in. This is Whiskey Hotel. Over. We are taking heavy artillery fire and tanks have been sighted over the ridge. Requesting immediate air support. This position will be overrun. Alpha Command, do you read? Alpha Command. Hello and welcome to the World History Addicts podcast. I'm your host, Devin, and this episode is about the history of weapons from stone clubs and spears to swords and crossbows to tanks like the ones in the introduction and drones, and how they affected history and wars, in the sciences, and in society too. Let's begin. The Stone Age is the earliest stage of humans, and anything earlier goes into pre-human history with hominids that were around before Homo sapiens. Weapons actually predate humans. They predate Homo sapiens by a significant amount of time because humans are roughly 200,000 years old, while evidence of stone blades and sticks that were used as weapons go back millions of years in the hands of other hominids like the Homo habilis and Australopithecus. But this was still a major breakthrough because every other animal used natural weapons like claws and teeth. They didn't purposely construct tools that were meant for fighting. And humans in the Stone Age could create sharpened stone tools and create just about any club or spear weapon that a pre-human hominid could have made. But humans went a step further, and they innovated with strings and sticks to create a better ranged weapon in the spear thrower, or the atlatl 42,000 years ago, and the bow and arrow 12,000 years ago, and the sling somewhere in the middle because it's not entirely clear when the sling was invented or who invented it, and the slings also tend to degrade much more than bows or spear throwers. But it's been suspected that all three of these weapons were invented and reinvented independently at different times around the world. So I think they're simple enough that different cultures could invent them convergently. They didn't need to be spread by one specific culture that created them. And so for most of human history, or the human experience, was totals about 200,000 years. For 185,000 of those years, a warrior would be armed with weapons made out of wood, bone, animal hide, and sinew, and stone. That was the best that they had at the time. But this all changed in the Neolithic era around the Fertile Crescent, which is the western part of the Middle East today. Because once you start having large human settlements, farms, and people discovering how to use metal as an entirely new material, it revolutionized what could be done with tools and also with weapons. And this is arguably the first big divergence around the world, because this development didn't happen everywhere at the same time. And if it did happen at all, because there were places in America and Oceania that never had a Neolithic age to begin with, and they effectively remained in the Stone Age after other parts of the Old World moved on. And this pattern will continue throughout history, with uneven development and change in some areas, but not in others being the rule, not the exception. The first metal that humans learned to craft was copper, and that occurs naturally in lumps, and it can be shaped into blades, whether knives, spear points, or axe heads. Though full-length swords wouldn't have been possible because copper was too brittle for long, heavy-bladed weapons. But it was later discovered around 5,000 years ago, or around 3,300 BC, that you could mix tin with copper and create an alloy called bronze. And that was stronger, and it was better suited to making tools and weapons than either of them could alone. And that's where the first swords appear. Like, you got the Egyptian khopesh, which is a sickle sword that you can chop and you can slash with. Or you got China's jian, the double-edged straight-bladed sword, which is more for stabbing. But it's also where the first shields appear, because before this, there wasn't really much of a reason to have a shield, because it's not like saber-toothed tigers or elephants were throwing anything that you need to block. It was much better to just shoot them from a range, or just use two-handed spears up close. But when fighting other humans, shields become very important because you have to dodge missile projectiles that are being thrown, and you have to dodge or block sword attacks at close range. So this, I think, the development of the shield shows that it's around this era that humans start fighting each other in significant numbers outside of just like small-scale tribal raids. And the Bronze Age is also where you start to see large, well-known civilizations like the Egyptians and the Israelites and ancient China and India. And with the power of state funding and bureaucracy, you get standing armies with professional soldiers and standardized equipment and battle tactics, where numbers and cohesion mean much more than just the individual warrior's skill. And the main strategy used by these large Bronze Age states was shield walls. Many soldiers lined up and protected by large shields, and they're armed with spears, usually one-handed spears because you needed one hand to hold the shield, or just a one-handed sword. Though China also experimented with two-handed polearms that were designed to hook and drag horsemen off their mounts, and they also had early types of crossbows too. Now, the Iron Age begins around 1200 BC or 3,000 years ago in the Near East because of the Bronze Age collapse, and it sees the collapse of the whole system. There were droughts, there were famines, there were plagues, there were these gigantic migrations and invasions of a collection of people from North Africa and Southern Europe called the Sea Peoples, and they overwhelmed the defenses of many of the large states like Egypt, the Hittites, Assyria, and Babylon. And they hastened the downfall of that whole civilization, because trade routes were being used to bring in tin from Afghanistan and as far up north as Britain. But because the trade routes weren't working, you could no longer make bronze because you didn't have the tin to mix with the copper to make the bronze. So iron starts to take over because because even though iron is not as good as bronze, it's something that you can work with more autonomously. You can just have like a small settlement that does iron working. But over time, the iron starts to be refined, and it starts to get better and better. And you get swords like Greece's Xiphos, and they're also like the leaf-bladed swords that the Celtic cultures use. And eventually Rome starts using the gladius because steel also starts to come into the picture. Now, steel had actually been around and been used before the Iron Age, even all the way back to the Mid-Bronze Age. But the problem was it was difficult to produce, and it was largely outshined by bronze and later by iron just because they're easier to make. However, in the early Middle Ages, around 500 AD, steel starts to replace iron. Though, like the Neolithic Revolution, it doesn't happen everywhere. There are still parts of the world where either they don't have any kind of iron or bronze or steel, or they just still use iron over steel because it's easier to make. Europe adopts it around 500 AD or replaces the iron with steel around 500 AD. But in China, it's closer to 200 AD, and in India, it goes as far back as 200 BC. And in my opinion, the Age of Steel is one of the golden ages of weapons design because it's the age of the knights, because they have steel plate armor, and they have many different types of swords and polearms like the halberd and the poleaxe that are designed to get through armor. And it's the era of the samurai with the famous katana and awesome lamellar armor and the Kanabo war clubs. And you got other warrior cultures too, like in the Middle East, you got the Mamluks. In India, you have the Rajputs with lots of these really interesting looking weapons. And it's also because lots of different weapon philosophies and designs were still kind of valid because many people just didn't know how to make certain types of armor, so you didn't have to all converge on a really specific form of weapon design like in Europe that was intended specifically to overcome heavy armor. And in later eras, guns and missiles start to look very similar to each other, which really kind of cuts down on weapon diversity. It's also in the Age of Steel that they're very powerful crossbows. You can use gears and pulleys to generate more force than anyone could push or pull on their own, and they can shoot through metal armor up close. And before this, China actually had a very interesting crossbow called the Chukono, which allows you to rapid-fire arrows by moving this lever up and down. And it moves a box filled with arrows at the same time as the string. So when you move the arrow up, it stretches out the bow, and then when you move it down, it releases and shoots an arrow. So it almost works like an early machine gun. And at this point in time, the main hierarchy of force is you have armored heavy cavalry at the top, especially in Europe with knights with really thick, heavy armor that's difficult to get through, because they can kill large numbers of peasants or just spearmen who don't have heavy armor on. Though they're not invincible because they can be beaten by either really well-disciplined and trained pikemen like in Switzerland, because they can just stop the horses with their spears and they can wrestle the knight off the horse and stop him that way, or English longbowmen like in the 1415 Battle of Agincourt, because the knights were just weren't on great terrain. They were trying to attack the English archers over mud, and they just kept raining arrows on them until they fell over into the mud, and they just ended up being killed right then and there. But ultimately, this age where blades were king starts to come to an end as another great innovation sweeps the scene, and that innovation is gunpowder. Now, the invention of gunpowder is probably the most ironic development in human history because it was actually designed to be an elixir of immortality in China in the 800s AD during the Tang Dynasty. But it's actually arguably killed more people than just about any other kind of weapon, including swords, including arrows, including even nuclear bombs, because millions and millions have been killed with bullets and explosives, but less than 1 million have been killed using nuclear weapons. So originally it's used to create fireworks and early types of bombs, but in the year 904 AD, it starts being used in the form of fire arrows that can be used to set enemy fortifications on fire. So the Chinese in the Tang Dynasty and the Song Dynasty start innovating with gunpowder. They invent fire lances that allow a spearman to blast a cloud of pellets at opponents in close range, kind of like a shotgun or an early flamethrower, though it's not all that reliable and it's not all that powerful. So, and they also created these really wacky-looking devices called the nest of bees that allows you to shoot hundreds of arrows with gunpowder all at the same time, almost like a modern missile battery. But it's not until a few centuries later in the 1200s that you start to see the first cannons that appear in China. First, they're made out of bamboo with iron rings to reinforce them. But then you also get bronze cannons. And the Mongols spread this technology into the Middle East and then into Europe, where they become a major part of the Western arsenals because they keep innovating them to become more powerful and easier to use so that they can take down enemy castles. And it's also around this time that you start to get scaled-down cannons or hand cannons that are just designed to be shot by one person. And over the course of the 1300s to the 1400s, these evolved into the arquebus, which is a more ergonomic version because there's a shoulder stock that you can use to aim it, and there's just more of a grip so that it's more comfortable to hold. And there's also a trigger that lowers a lit wick or match into the touch hole so it can shoot. And you don't have to hold it with one hand and then put the fire into the gun with the other hand to shoot it. The 1400s or 15th century is also when shipbuilding in Europe really starts to take off, especially in Iberia, which was then under Muslim control, because you get several breakthroughs in naval technology, and there are these sea vessels called caravels that can sail across the ocean. And put together by the late 1400s, the Ottoman Turks start using cannons, which I believe were actually made in Germany, and there's very massive and well-designed cannons. They destroy the walls of Constantinople in 1453 and take over the last of the Eastern Romans. And this starts to mark the early modern era with small numbers of usually European soldiers with ships and firearms. They can conquer vast territories like those in the Americas, and they can put major pressure on coastal parts of Asia in a way that had never been possible before. So from the 1500s to the 1700s, European militaries begin focusing very heavily around firearms and other kinds of gunpowder weapons, while Asia starts to stagnate in arms development, and they keep a mix of medieval pre-gunpowder weapons like swords and bows, and maybe some arquebuses, while Europe refines the arquebus from just a weapon that you need a lit piece of cord to fire into flintlock and wheel-lock muskets that's either you have to wind it up and then pull the trigger and it creates sparks, or you just pull back the flint and then pull the trigger and it shoots that way. And an interesting side note is that they also innovated with this other kind of variant called the blunderbuss. It's kind of like a sawed-off musket, and it's designed for close range. And it has this barrel that's shaped like a funnel, so that because the idea was that it sprays a bunch of shrapnel and pellets. But it was eventually found that the funnel shape doesn't actually make it shoot out more, even though you'd assume it does. But it is easier to reload just because it's just larger, and you can just put the powder and the shot into it more easily. Another thing to keep in mind is that swords and polearms still existed in this time period because, especially if it wasn't in Europe, because though swords were generally redesigned, like they became cutlasses and sabers and other kinds of weapons because you didn't need to focus on like really slender kind of swords to stab through armor because most people wouldn't be wearing armor. It just wasn't practical anymore. There were too many bullets and too many guns on the battlefield for heavy armor to be all that effective, unless you're part of a special unit like the Winged Hussars that are effectively like knights on horseback, but they also have guns, and they're designed more to just break up enemy troop formations. Another interesting point is Japan actually did adopt firearms because from the 1460s up to the early 1600s, they were in a massive civil war that I covered in the Japanese trilogy. And they weren't in any real position to turn down new ways of killing each other. So when the Portuguese showed up and introduced them to firearms, they jumped on that bandwagon. And at some point during the 1500s, they were probably the best armed country in the whole world because they just had more guns and just more musketeers than everyone else. But once the country closed its borders, once they solidified power, they started to actually move away from guns because they just weren't really needed anymore. Though this would eventually change in the 1800s as I went over in part 2 of Japan. So this era is also where the first grenades come from, and it's also where the first grenade launchers come from. Though neither of them were especially reliable because they're still using the same kind of ignition method with the flintlocks. You couldn't really be sure when it would go off, and oftentimes people would just blow themselves up by accident. So it's a very, very dangerous weapon for pretty much everyone involved. And by the late 1700s, the European armies in the West at least, had perfected the flintlock. And not only had they figured out that flint was just better for igniting the powder charges and shooting the gun, but the Industrial Revolution is beginning, and you start to see more and more uniform firearms that have interchangeable parts. They're all standardized. They have interchangeable calibers, so you can use the same types of bullets for all of them. Though even with this, they are, at the end of the day, still a single-shot muzzle-loading weapon that's slow to reload, and rifles which were modified because the bullet has these parts carved out inside that make the bullet spin, so it's more accurate. It worked kind of like a football. It's designed to be more stable in flight. But in that case, it's actually even more slow to load because it gets caught on the bullet gets caught on the grooves. You have to clean it even more. It's kind of a pain to use, so smoothbore weapons were just used more often. And it's also why, as I mentioned before, pikes and long spears were generally paired with muskets and arquebuses just because the guns were just too slow to use on their own. But in the 1600s, they simplified this and decided to just put a knife at the end of the musket, the bayonet. Originally, you actually had to plug it inside the musket itself, but that also just blocked the barrel so you couldn't shoot it. And in the 1700s, they came up with a socket bayonet where you actually lock it around this lug area around the front of the gun, so you don't have to just plug up your gun every time you want to stab someone with it. And by the end of the 1700s, it's kind of around the end of the age of handmade or workshop-made guns because now it's factories that's making guns, not just craftsmen. And now we're in the age of engines, in the 1800s. So the Industrial Revolution affected every part of life in the areas where it became the norm, and weapons are no exception. So now that there are factories and precise lathes and better machining tools, guns can be made much more quickly. They can be made much more cheaply, and they can be made consistently too, which also leads to the invention of post-flintlock weapons like the percussion cap, where you use a special cap made out of mercury fulminate, and when you crush it, it sparks, and you can use that to set off the gunpowder and shoot it, which is actually much faster than the flintlocks or the wheel locks because there's a little bit of a delay, and it takes some time for the spark to ignite the main powder. So if you're hunting with like let's say a flintlock musket, there will be an initial explosion when you pull the trigger, and then the main charge will shoot out. But that initial kind of flash gives off like the fact that you're shooting, and a bird will see that and fly away. Bullet or 6 barrels that each have their own bullet loaded inside them, but they're also just really heavy, and the accuracy is really bad. So they're not all that good for anything other than very close range self-defense. So the first actual reliable and affordable repeating gun is the Colt revolver. And from here, repeating guns started to become the norm. The big discovery that changes everything actually goes all the way back to 1808 because up until then, you're effectively building the bullet inside the gun. Like you put down the powder and the wadding, and then you put the bullet, and then you have to shoot the gun, and then you have to do the process all over again. But if you have everything contained inside a metal cartridge, you can just put that into the gun and shoot it, and then just put another cartridge in and shoot that. And because it's all kind of cleanly contained, you can just automate the process by just having a magazine that has a bunch of these metal cases. And like in the Henry and Spencer lever action rifles, you just work the lever, and it just feeds the bullet in, and you can just shoot it over and over really quickly. The middle of the 19th century is also the end of the age of sail because wind-powered ships had pretty much been the norm for thousands of years. But now they're being replaced with steam-powered ships and ironclads, and even some early submarines in the American Civil War. Though those wouldn't make a whole lot of sense in wars up until about World War I, because most of the wars up around that time were between a colonial power and a pre-modern people who just didn't have anything really that you could use the submarines on in the first place. But in World War I, you have lots of these large industrial great powers who could all make submarines. So using them became a real necessity. And in the late 19th century, you start to see the first machine guns, because once you have self-contained cartridges, you can just automate. You can automate it even further, and you could just have the recoil operate the system, so it just keeps shooting the gun over and over again. The first of these was the Maxim gun, invented by the British in 1884. And then you have the first semi-auto pistol called the Borchardt, invented in Germany in 1893. But early semi-auto pistols were not very reliable. They were not very ergonomic. They're kind of clunky to use, and revolvers were considered to be pretty much superior in terms of both the ease of use and the reliability, up until World War I, where you get the 1911 pistol and the German PO8, which became the new standard. So the turn of the century also sees the inventions of several major military vehicles, including planes, tanks, and trucks, which were all used in World War I, which makes it the first true mechanized war, and it was a sign of the conflicts to come in the rest of the century. And World War I was especially brutal and horrifying, too, because there were new and deadly weapons that had either never been used before or just hadn't been used at this scale or in centuries, because there was poison gas and there was flamethrowers, and there was also modern artillery that could shell cities from miles away and just destroy everything. Another big development was automatic handheld firearms, because you get the Browning automatic rifle, you get the Lewis gun used by the British. Russia had their Fedorov Automat, which is actually the first assault rifle. It was just really delicate and not very reliable, so it didn't take over the whole arms meta. And Germany invented the first submachine gun in the MP-18, which is actually the first ever of its kind. Then you have the interwar period, which is where radiation becomes invented and nuclear power. And eventually this becomes the Manhattan Project. And by the end of World War II, there are now nuclear weapons, and that starts to end. I think I would say that pretty much ends the age of engines and creates an entirely new age of weapons. But before that happened, World War II takes place, and there is another huge renaissance of weapons. One of them is kind of the competing philosophies over how you should arm a squad of men with guns. So the default was kind of a holdover from World War I, because the focus was on riflemen, and they have one light machine gun that holds maybe 30 rounds inside it, which is better than a rifle, but it's also a bit on the heavier side, and it's designed more as support. It's not the main focus of the squad. The British use this and the Japanese use this, and it didn't do very well against other armies unless they had massive artillery or air support to back them up. The Germans went in the opposite direction, and they actually de-emphasized the riflemen, and they put these a heavier belt-fed machine gun that could hold closer to like 100 to 200 rounds. In their case, the MG-34 or MG-42, which was known as Hitler's buzzsaw. It can mow down entire waves of enemy soldiers, and the whole philosophy is build everything around the machine gunner. Like you want the riflemen to just act as like ammo bearers. You want them to just protect the machine gunner when he's changing out the barrels or reloading it, and just focus on rushing forward and putting down the machine guns. You can pretty much stop anything that tries to come your way. But the problem is that once you take out the machine gunner, like if he gets hit by an artillery shell or by a sniper, the whole system starts to fall apart. In the Soviet case, they decided that. They went into World War II with pretty much the same philosophy as the British or the Japanese, but they also realized that wasn't working very well against the German system. And the Soviet doctrine is just not all that interested in quality. They're just interested in quality to the point that their quantity can overwhelm the enemy. So instead, they opted for large numbers of submachine guns that could hold up to, called the PPSH-41, which can hold up to 71 bullets in these drum magazines. And they can shoot all of those rounds in under 10 seconds. So you have like these swarms of men with submachine guns running around the Germans in the rubble of Stalingrad, mowing them down. And that's pretty effective, but only if there's not a prepared defense, because if they try that against Germany's belt-fed machine guns, they end up getting mowed down themselves. However, the best philosophy, which I actually independently kind of came up with, just because I was thinking about the best way to organize a squad. But it turns out someone else got there first, and that was the USMC, because their philosophy was multiple light machine guns to spread out the firepower, so you can't just lose everything if one guy gets hit by a lucky bullet. And you have that. You have riflemen to back them up and carry the ammo for them. But you also have a subunit of men with submachine guns, shotguns, and flamethrowers to break into pillboxes and overwhelm anyone defending on the inside. And I think the reason that it works so well, and it outcompeted pretty much every other one of these infantry philosophies in World War II, because it just specializes for the situations you actually get into. Like you have multiple light machine guns for long range, and you have submachine guns and shotguns for close range. And so at the end of World War II, there's nuclear weapons, and that effectively makes conventional wars obsolete, especially by 1949, because then the Soviet Union also has nuclear weapons. So if both sides have nuclear weapons, they can just wipe each other out in a number of hours. So that kind of makes conventional warfare just kind of pointless. However, there's only nine countries today. There was South Africa, which did have nuclear weapons back in the 1980s, but they had to dismantle them after apartheid ended. But today we have America, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Britain, France, Israel, and North Korea who have nuclear weapons. But only two of them, America and Russia, realistically have the power to eliminate the whole world with their nukes. So arms development didn't stop, and it just kind of shifted to be more about delivery systems, as well as stopping insurgencies and rebels. The reason for this is that after World War II, the European empires start to fall apart. The British, the French, Portugal, the Belgians, and the Dutch start losing control of their territories outside of Europe, usually to bands of armed native guerrilla fighters who have less firepower and less training than their colonial masters. So it leads to a focus on both advanced jet fighters and stealth fighters and nuclear submarines designed to counter the Soviet Union, or in the Soviet case, to counter the West, but also better infantry weapons to stop rebels and irregular troops. So going back to the infantry squad philosophies of the pre-atomic age, those were effectively all made obsolete by assault rifles, because they can do pretty much anything that a submachine gun or a bolt-action rifle can do, and better too. They require much less training to use. So the philosophy became more about if you just had one big machine gun and a bunch of assault riflemen, or if we had multiple smaller machine guns and assault riflemen as just kind of backup. Though there's a third option, because the first option is used by pretty much every military today except for the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army is kind of stuck to its roots and just uses the dispersed firepower kind of model. And the third option, which is used more by terrorists or insurgents or other kinds of non-state actors like Hamas or the rebel armies in Myanmar, is you just have no heavy machine guns, no light machine guns, just a lot of guys with assault rifles and grenade launchers, pretty much to maximize mobility and firepower. And at the end of the 20th century, you start to see the beginning of drones, and they're used as kind of remote killing machines that can be operated by someone who's not even on the same continent as the target. And increasingly, they're becoming automated, and they're very deadly and very intelligent, and that leads to some serious questions as to what would happen if they ever went rogue. So now we're in the modern day and getting into the future, and no one knows what the future is going to hold. But I do have a few predictions for what the future of arms development is going to look like. The safest bet, I think, is AI is going to get more important. It's already very, very important in drone warfare. It's also going to become more important things like missiles. So you can calculate very quickly where a missile should be shot at, because you can predict where someone's going to be at a certain time. Artillery has the same principle, and in the sniping case, the AI can tell you, say, where the wind is blowing, or how far something is, or how or where the target is likely to move. There's all this probability involved. And the other big revolution, I believe, is going to be in firearms technology. There's just going to be more better plastics that are going to be designed for guns to make them both stronger and more durable, and also just lighter. Ammunition is probably going to become caseless. I think there's going to be a move away from the metallic case model and towards a type of self-contained bullet that just that once it's shot, it's gone. Nothing needs to be ejected. There's nothing that gets caught in the gun and jams it up. And it also saves on weight too. And the final one I believe is kinetic weapons and other kind of alternate energy weapons like, say, railguns. So far, the U.S. Navy uses them, and they're pretty powerful but they also take up a lot of power, and I don't think there's a whole lot they can do that regular artillery can't already do, or regular missiles can't already do. But I think over time, they're going to be refined, and they're going to be scaled down so that infantry soldiers can use them too. Laser weapons are probably not coming, like the ones from Star Wars are probably not going to be real. But spaceships, I think, at some point will probably be militarized if there's ever another space race and outer space becomes a contested zone. So in conclusion, the history of weaponry is one of the most interesting topics in the world because mankind is fundamentally inseparable from war and battles once there's a large enough number of people to take part in them. Weapons evolve with technology, but it's also a major driver of technology as few things motivate funding or innovation like an existential arms race. Early forms of technology like the guns often seem kind of stupid or inefficient or even useless compared to what they already have in the case of, say, bow and arrows. But as they refine, the full potential of what they have to offer gets unlocked, and they can surpass pretty much everything that came before it. And the same is true with early cars or early computers. Weapons are, however, at the end of the day, a product of the society, the people and the culture and the economy that created them. They represent what a people could do and what they needed to do at any given point in time. The atomic age has shown us that sometimes progress is too much of a good thing, and any innovation capable of good is also incapable of incredible destruction. And as Albert Einstein once said, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." It's often been argued back and forth whether war is some innate part of the human psyche or condition or just human nature. But I say that even if it isn't, it's unlikely to disappear because it's just too useful for those in power because war is ultimately just politics by other means, and it just makes way too much money for them to turn down. Thank you for listening in. You can follow us at World History Addicts Podcast on Instagram for more episodes and releases. This podcast is both on YouTube and Spotify, and if you're on either of those platforms, be sure to check out my friend Dwan's podcast called The Entertainment Fanatics. He's on Instagram at Entertainment Fanatics Pod. Thanks again, and the next series on the history of Latin America will be coming soon.